While Donald Trump was busy posting on Truth Social about making Canada the 51st state and threatening Prime Minister Mark Carney with total economic destruction, something happened in Brussels that nobody in Washington saw coming. On January the 2nd, 2026, four major U.S. allies, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, formally submitted applications to join the European Union's Safe Defense Program, the same exclusive club that just admitted Canada as its first non-European member 6 weeks ago. And according to leaked European Commission documents obtained by CNN, all four applications are expected to be approved by March 15th. This isn't about trade agreements or diplomatic ceremonies. This is about the systematic construction of a post-American security architecture that could reshape global power for the next 50 years. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand why Pentagon officials are using words like catastrophic and irreversible in classified memos about what's unfolding right now. Here's what makes this moment unprecedented. When Canada joined SAFE in December 2025, most Washington analysts treated it as an isolated incident, a frustrated neighbor finding alternatives after years of Trump's threats and tariffs. But leaked documents from the European External Action Service tell a completely different story. According to sources familiar with the negotiations, European defense ministers have been quietly building what they're calling a framework for allied non-EU partners, or FAUP, since August 2025. The goal? Create a permanent institutional structure that allows trusted democracies outside Europe to participate in European defense production, bypassing American systems entirely. Canada wasn't an exception. Canada was the proof of concept. And now that the model works, four more countries want in. The numbers here are staggering. SAFE currently manages 150 billion euros in defense financing for 27 European Union member states. But internal EU budget projections obtained by CNN show that if Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand are admitted, total program financing could expand to 340 billion euros by 2030. That's 340 billion in defense contracts, production partnerships, and technology sharing agreements that American companies will be completely locked out of. For context, U.S. defense exports to these five countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, totaled $48 billion in 2024 alone. We're watching America's closest allies systematically replace their dependence on Washington with a European alternative, and it's happening faster than anyone predicted. So, let's talk about what's actually in these applications because the details matter. According to leaked submission documents reviewed by CNN, each of the four countries offered the European Union something Washington never could: long-term strategic predictability. Australia's application, submitted by Defense Minister Richard Marles on January 2nd, includes commitments to invest 34 billion Australian dollars into European defense manufacturing over the next decade. We're talking about joint production facilities for missiles, drone systems, and naval technology that would operate on European soil, but leverage Australian rare earth minerals and advanced materials expertise. Japan's proposal goes even further. Sources familiar with the application say Tokyo offered to establish 3 dedicated production centers in Poland, Romania, and Finland, specifically focused on precision electronics, semiconductor components for weapon systems, and autonomous vehicle technology. The price tag? 52 billion US dollars over 12 years, with Japanese firms taking minority stakes in European defense companies to ensure technology transfer flows both directions. South Korea's application might be the most aggressive. Leaked Ministry of Defense planning documents show Seoul proposing to build an entire artillery production complex in Eastern Europe capable of manufacturing 500,000 shells annually, addressing Europe's most urgent ammunition shortage. South Korean defense contractors would operate the facilities under European regulatory oversight, with 60% of output reserved for EU member states and 40% available for export to other safe participants. The estimated investment? $18 billion, with production scheduled to begin by late 2027. And New Zealand, while smaller economically, is offering something equally valuable: access to Five Eyes intelligence sharing infrastructure. According to sources in Wellington, New Zealand's application includes provisions to extend certain intelligence protocols to European partners, effectively creating a bridge between the Five Eyes network and European security services without requiring formal U.S. approval. Here's what makes all of this legally possible. SAFE's founding treaty, signed in March 2024, includes Article 12, Paragraph 3, which allows non-EU participation if the applicant meets 3 criteria: democratic governance, commitment to European security objectives, and willingness to adopt EU defense procurement standards. Canada met those requirements. Now, four more countries are arguing they qualify too. And according to leaked European Commission legal analysis obtained by CNN, there's no valid reason to reject them. Now, here's where this stops being a trade story and becomes a constitutional crisis for American foreign policy. The United States has spent 75 years building a security architecture based on one foundational assumption that America's allies depend on Washington for protection, and that dependence creates leverage. NATO exists because European countries couldn't defend themselves without American military power. The US Japan Security Treaty exists because Tokyo needed American nuclear umbrella guarantees. ANZUS exists because Australia and New Zealand required American naval protection in the Pacific. South Korea's entire defense posture has been built around the presence of 28,500 US troops on the peninsula. This wasn't charity, this was strategy. American defense commitments created obligations that translated into political influence, basing rights, intelligence cooperation, and ultimately control over how the entire Western alliance operated. But what happens when that dependence evaporates? What happens when America's closest allies look at 4 years of Trump threatening tariffs, questioning treaty commitments, and treating partnerships like extortion opportunities, and decide they need alternatives? According to leaked Pentagon assessments reviewed by CNN, defense planners have been warning since 2023 that continued unpredictability in U.S. foreign policy would eventually push allies toward European defense cooperation. The assessment specifically identified SAFE as a strategic threat, noting that if non-European countries gained access, it could create a parallel defense ecosystem that reduces demand for American weapon systems by up to 40% over 20 years. That warning was delivered to the National Security Council in August 2023. It was ignored, and now it's happening exactly as predicted. Sources familiar with internal deliberations say the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency has calculated that if all 5 countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, shift just 30% of their defense procurement to European sources through SAFE, American defense contractors stand to lose approximately $290 billion in revenue between 2026 and 2040. That's not speculative. That's based on current contract pipelines and projected spending increases. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics. These companies have built their business models on the assumption that allied nations had no alternative to American systems. That assumption just collapsed, and the consequences are going to reshape the entire defense industrial base. So, let's talk about what this actually means for global power distribution, because the implications go far beyond defense contracts. For the entire post-World War II era, the United States has been able to conduct foreign policy with one massive structural advantage. Allies had no choice but to align with Washington because they couldn't defend themselves otherwise. If you were South Korea and needed protection from North Korea, you accepted American terms. If you were Japan and needed a nuclear deterrent against China, you lived with U.S. military bases on your territory. If you were Australia and wanted security guarantees in the Indo-Pacific, you supported American wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, whether you agreed with them or not. That leverage shaped everything from trade negotiations to UN voting patterns to intelligence sharing arrangements. But leverage only works if there are no alternatives, and now there are alternatives. According to leaked diplomatic cables obtained by CNN, European leaders have been explicit in private conversations about what safe expansion represents. One cable from the German Defense Ministry to Chancellor Scholz, dated December 18, 2025, describes the program as creating strategic autonomy for democracies that can no longer rely on American consistency. Another cable, this one from the French Foreign Ministry, refers to SAFE as the foundation for a post-Atlantic security order. These aren't theoretical discussions. These are operational plans backed by hundreds of billions in financing and legal frameworks that are already being implemented. Here's what that means in practice. If Japan shifts 30% of its defense procurement to European sources through SAFE, Tokyo gains leverage it's never had before in negotiations with Washington. When the U.S. demands basing rights or threatens trade restrictions, Japanese officials can point to alternative partnerships and say, "We're not entirely dependent on you anymore." The same calculus applies to South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Each of these countries has spent decades negotiating from positions of weakness because they had no security alternatives to American protection. SAFE changes that equation fundamentally. And the timing couldn't be worse for Washington. According to sources familiar with Pentagon planning, the Department of Defense is already projecting budget constraints through 2030, due to domestic spending pressures and the need to modernize nuclear forces. That means less capacity for the kind of massive aid packages and security guarantees that historically kept allies dependent. At the exact moment when American resources are tightening, Europe is offering allied nations a fully funded alternative that doesn't come with Trump's threats, tariffs, or unpredictability. From a strategic perspective, this is catastrophic. But here's the part that should terrify anyone paying attention. This isn't happening because of ideology or anti-American sentiment. This is happening because American leadership became unreliable. According to leaked polling conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations in November 2025, 68% of defense officials in allied nations said they no longer trust the United States to honor security commitments after 2028. That number was 34% in 2020. The collapse in confidence is directly attributable to Trump's rhetoric and policies, and it's driving allies toward alternatives at a speed nobody predicted. So, where does this go from here? According to leaked European Commission timelines obtained by CNN, formal approval votes for Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand are scheduled for March 15, 2026. Sources familiar with the process say all four applications have already cleared preliminary technical reviews, and barring unexpected political opposition, admission is virtually guaranteed. That means by April, SAFE will have expanded from 27 European Union members to include 5 of America's most critical Pacific allies. The first joint production contracts under the expanded program are expected to be signed by June 2026, with initial facilities operational by early 2027. But the real question is what happens next in Washington. So far, the Trump administration's response has been almost non-existent. According to sources inside the National Security Council, Trump was briefed on the 4 applications on January 3rd and reportedly dismissed the issue as European nonsense that doesn't matter. But Pentagon officials are significantly more concerned. Leaked internal Defense Department memos describe the SAFE expansion as a strategic realignment with generational consequences and warned that without immediate policy changes, the U.S. could lose its position as the primary security provider for the Indo-Pacific by 2035. The problem is that reversing this trend would require exactly the kind of long-term commitment and diplomatic consistency that Trump has spent years undermining. Allies aren't joining SAFE because they hate America. They're joining because they can't trust American leadership to remain stable across election cycles. Fixing that requires more than promises. It requires demonstrating through actions over years that the United States is a reliable partner again. And there's no indication the Trump administration understands that or cares. Meanwhile, Europe is moving forward. According to sources in Brussels, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is expected to announce a formal expansion of SAFE's budget to 340 billion euros during a speech on January 20th, the same day as Trump's inauguration. The symbolism isn't accidental. Europe is making it clear that the post-American security order isn't a threat or a bluff. It's happening right now, with or without Washington's approval. And for the first time in 75 years, America's closest allies have the financial resources, industrial capacity, and political will to defend themselves without us. The only question left is whether anyone in Washington will realize what's been lost before it's too late.